Welcome to Malard at Large. Tonight, my guest is Kadri Liik, senior analyst at the European Council for Foreign Affairs. Right now, her TV profile by Ellen Corby.
Kadri Liik is now a researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations. But this Estonian woman, born on June 7, 1970, first embraced another career. She graduated from the University of Tartu in Estonia, journalism. Then went to England to study for a master's degree in foreign relations, specializing in diplomacy at the University of Lancaster. After graduation, Kadri Liik moved to Moscow. This is how she became a correspondent for several Estonian newspapers and for the Baltic News Service news agency. In the 2000s, she became foreign news editor at Postimees, an Estonian daily newspaper. She then took over the management of the monthly foreign affairs magazine, Diplomatia. Kadri Liik also worked behind the microphone, hosting Valis Maharia, a news talk show on Radio Kuku, a Tallinn-based channel. In 2006, she stepped aside to become a diplomat. Kadri Liik became the director of the International Center for Defense Studies, the leading think tank on foreign policy issues in Estonia. A year later, the new director launched the Lennart Meri Conference, an annual meeting that brings together decision-makers, military, academics, and politicians from all over the world in Tallinn for 3 days. In 2012, Kadri Liik joined the European Council on Foreign Relations as a senior researcher. Founded in 2007, the ECFR is an independent organization which conducts research and communicates on the development of an effective and coherent European foreign policy. Kadri Liik is an expert on Russia and a member of the wider Europe Research Program. Her knowledge of the field allows her to have a fine and nuanced approach.
Tonight, my guest in Malard at Large is Kadri Liik, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Thanks for being with us. And we go straight to the questions right now. My first question is, globally, Mrs. Liik, how do you view 2023? What kind of year might it be? Politically, economically, I would even say militarily?
I think it will be a turbulent year. Of course, Europe will be adapting with its consequences, including economic ones. I think for Europe economically, this year will also be an important year of decoupling from Russian energy and much of the economic relationship we have had with Russia, but started already last year. And I think it will continue this year. We need to find alternative energy supplies to Russian gas and so forth. And of course, there is nuclear threat hanging above all of us. So that is also something to think about.
Vladimir Putin said recently, quote, "I am open to negotiations with Ukraine. Finally, we will need to find a way to end the conflict." Is he credible? Is he reliable when he says that? All the more so as we know about the common hatred he and Volodymyr Zelensky have towards one another.
I do not think a personal hatred plays a role here, but I don't think that Putin's offer is credible. I think Russia would be ready to end the war if Ukraine surrendered. If you follow the statements, the conditions Russia is setting, it is quite obvious that they are not giving up on their maximalist war aims. And this is not something that Ukraine is prepared to talk about, especially given that they are having the upper hand on the battlefield. Russia might be keen to have sort of temporary truce, exactly in order to improve its performance, as Russia has started this war in a very badly prepared and badly thought through manner. They have lost many people, lots of equipment, and they would benefit from a break in fighting. So I suspect that many of Russia's ceasefire offers actually mean that they just want a break to gather strength and then continue anew. So unfortunately, I don't think that sustainable peace is on the horizon for now.
So Putin would like to do a kind of strategic move.
Yes, I don't think he has given up on his war aims, and he's ready to change tactics, but not the overall aim. And he doesn't see that what he set out to achieve is not achievable in principle. I mean, he wants to subdue Ukraine so that Ukraine would become a loyal part of Russia. That is impossible. I mean, especially now, after what they have done during that war, it is completely impossible. But he's not prepared to see that.
On the other hand, Mrs. Liik, don't you have the impression that Volodymyr Zelensky would like to lead the US, Europe, and NATO in an open war with Russia? Is Zelensky a kind of warmonger?
No, I don't have that impression at all. I do not think that Zelensky has outlandish ideas such as leading the United States. I think he knows fully well that Ukraine's success on battlefields depends on the support the United States is giving to them. But for that, Ukraine also needs to be careful about the red lines that US has set, and they have been. I mean, they haven't been bombing Russia's territory deep inside Russia with American weapons. And I think that's one of the red lines America has imposed, and that's being followed very well. And in general, I don't think we should view Zelensky as warmonger at all. I mean, he became president promising to end the war that was simmering low intensity in Donbass for 8 years. And I think he sincerely sought an agreement with Russia. He might not have been very skilled in that because he has no background in politics. He was unprepared when he became president. And yet again, I think that if Russia had been a little bit less maximalist in its position, then something could have been achieved. But maximalist demands by Russia have always been impossible for Ukraine to satisfy, not because any of its leaders is a warmonger, but Ukraine has very strong society, and society has its own ideas, what is acceptable and what is not. And unfortunately, Russia has failed to understand and accept that as reality and come up with proposals that Ukraine would have found acceptable. So that's why we are where we are.
But Mrs. Liik, what according to you would be an acceptable solution, as neither Vladimir Putin nor Volodymyr Zelensky must lose face? And I want to remind you, and you know that none of them wants to give back the territories to the others.
I think the whole Minsk process, Minsk agreements, that was allowing Putin a face-saving way out of Donbass, because already entering Donbass was a policy blunder by Russia. If you remember how they went in 2014, hoping that all of eastern Ukraine will raise up and wants to join Russia, that didn't happen. Ukraine didn't want that. And then Russia grabbed a bridgehead and used that as a leverage in negotiations. There was certain hope that Russia will seek a face-saving exit. Instead, they doubled down. So many of the things they wanted would have been achievable through negotiations as late as 1 year ago. They could have had neutral Ukraine. I would argue that this was actually available and discussed, though in hushed tones. They could have had arms control negotiations that was offered by President Biden. They prioritized dismemberment of Ukraine and territorial occupation above all else. So frankly, I do not think that saving the face of Putin should be anyone's worry after that. And how this conflict will end, I think it will be decided largely on the battlefield.
We have a break now, and we will be back in a few minutes. We are back with our guest, Kadri Liik, senior analyst at the European Council for International Affairs. According to you, if there is no diplomatic solution, could Vladimir Putin be tempted to use a nuclear arm in Ukraine, inside Ukraine, to end the conflict and reach his end?
There is that fear, yes, that he, when he feels cornered, he might do that. And I think that also explains the restrained approach by the United States. Given the weapons they deliver to Ukraine, given the red lines they impose on how these need to be used. So Russia needs to come to realization that what they have set out to do is impossible in principle. And frankly, nuclear bomb would not help them to have loyal Ukraine or international prestige or anything. But I think it'll take a while for Russia to understand that. So that danger is there, but that danger needs to be managed as best as one can. And first and foremost, I think it's the United States, another nuclear superpower, who is doing that management.
For the expert you are, is it still possible to offer Vladimir Putin a constructive role inside Europe instead of letting him drift away closer to China and Iran, which might create other serious problems in the future?
I do not think Vladimir Putin can personally have any constructive role in Europe, nor do I think he wants it. I think that Putin, when he came back to the Kremlin in 2012 for the second stint of his presidency after the break during which Dmitry Medvedev was in the Kremlin, he then redefined Russia as a non-Western country, and he stopped seeking engagement, even less integration with Europe. And I don't think that anyone in Europe is ready to offer him any role. He's frankly seen as war criminal by many in Europe, and rightly so. That does not mean that Russia could not in the future play a role. Russia is still a country that is geographically in Europe and Asia, but culturally it is very much European. I think Russians are not stupid. I think much of the establishment actually understands already how bad a blunder has Putin got into. I think they will want to undo at least some of its consequences. I think, and given Russia's the fierce drive for sovereignty, and that is really something that goes beyond Putin. I think Russians are a proud nation, and they don't want to be taking orders from the others. So I don't think that Russia will want to take orders from China either. So I think over time, Russia's dependence on China might be something that might start worrying political elite in Russia, and that would necessitate changes in their geopolitical calculations. But none of this will mean that Putin personally will have any role. I would rather suggest that these developments will happen after Putin has left the Kremlin, one way or other.
Don't you fear that as close friends of Putin's, Turkey and Hungary put their veto upon the entrance of Finland and Sweden into NATO?
No, I don't think so. I think both Turkey and Hungary are using their veto power to advance their own agenda, to bargain effectively. I mean, with Hungary, it's very obvious. You see what they are doing in the European Union. They block aid to Ukraine so that Europe would unblock some of the funds for Hungary that have been withheld because of non-democratic practices in Hungary. And Turkey, likewise, they have selfish agenda, not least to do with Kurds, etc. So But I don't think that, I mean, none of them is taking Russia's side earnestly. None of them is sort of trying to help Russia or actually really derail NATO. In both Turkey's and Hungary's interests is that NATO remain a viable organization. So if I were to predict anything, I would actually suggest that these ratifications will be done by the same time next year.
As I have said many times in this talk show, the world order under US dominance since 1945 is obsolete. For you, is China going to be the next key actor of the future world order facing the US and Europe?
Well, first I would dispute the premise. I don't think that the US has been so dominant since 1945. I mean, the world order that emerged in 1945, that was still the bipolar order of the Cold War. And Soviet Union was a formidable enemy to the United States. And we have forgotten now, but there have been many moments when it couldn't be taken for granted who wins that decades-long contest. So the US became a dominant power, indisputed dominant power in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I agree totally that this unipolar moment, as it was called, is now over. I mean, it started fragmenting already earlier. Now I think it is gone for purely objective reasons. Demographically and also in terms of GDP, the rest of the world is catching up with the West. There are new power centers emerging, and I don't think that is necessarily even a bad thing, but that will necessitate change of behavior by the West. I think the West will need to understand that it cannot be the sole norm setter in the world. And I think it's actually understanding it as well. It's actually evident that the period since 1990s, the sort of 20 or 30 years, when the West has tried to have the same normative model for many parts of the world, that hasn't worked out very well. And it has actually weakened the West itself, including the United States. So one needs to act differently. And I think it's good that we understand it now. In the future world order, I mean, China will inevitably play a prominent role, but there are also others. I mean, India will take over China in terms of population. There are other powers. So it will be if I were a Russian, I would say it will be a multipolar world.
Okay. Would you say that Europe and NATO are really fully united versus Putin when we know the longer the war will last, the more fragilized European countries' economies will be?
I think they are united, simply because it is hard to see alternative. I mean, Russia's position is such that very few people in their sane mind can consider negotiations. It's just not realistic, as we just discussed a short while before. And also, there is realization that whether Russia gets away with some tangible benefits from this war, or it suffers a defeat that will make it rethink, that will create a precedent that will strongly shape the future of the world politics. And I think we shouldn't underestimate these realizations. And as to the economy, I'm not sure it will get ever more fragile. It could also be that we are in turbulent waters for a while, but then we will establish new supply routes and situation will calm down, because right now the markets are adapting to cut off of Russian energy, and that is what has caused inflation, driven up gas prices, etc. When new supply routes are established, and somehow I believe they will, then I think these problems will not be so prominent any longer. And if we are lucky, it can even be that Russia's war in Ukraine will have sort of hastened green revolution and things like that.
According to you, who could be able to exert pressure upon Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky to strike a real peace? I am going to add, certainly not Emmanuel Macron, who is always keen on playing the role of mediator, but unsuccessfully until now, I understand.
Well, I'm ready to give President Macron some credit for trying to think of the future world order or European order and Russia's place in it. I also think that we should spell out that we see a place for Russia in the future world, that disintegration of Russia is actually not aim of the West, as much of Russia's propaganda claims these days. That said, I think right now it is actually premature to discuss these things in any seriousness. I think the future order will be very much dependent on the outcome of the battlefield. And as to pressure, no, I don't think there is really anyone at the moment. If we talk of personalities, I think that something needs to change in hard facts. I think Russia needs to understand that this war is costing it its future. Technologically, demographically, in terms of international leverage, reputation, everything. Once they realize that, then I think they will change the terms for how they, the vision for how they want to end it will change from the current maximalist one to something much more realistic.
Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, who was my guest in our talk show, told me, quote, Russia would not accept Iran as a nuclear power. Do you believe him? And do you believe Putin?
I mean, that has been Russia's official position for a long time. So, and Russia has cooperated with European powers on the Iran nuclear deal. So I don't think that Peskov necessarily lied to you. That said, the war may have changed things somewhat. Russia now needs Iran a lot more than was the case earlier. Iranian drones are really very useful for Russia's war fighting. And Russia is not necessarily interested in Iranian energy getting to the market because that would actually benefit the energy situation in the western part of the world.
Thank you, Madam, for having accepted our invitation. Good evening on I24 News, and see you soon on Malard at Large.